Imagine standing on the docks of Boston Harbor in the mid-18th century. Ships from England unload goods, taxed in ways the locals find unfair. Soldiers patrol the streets, and whispers of discontent travel through taverns and marketplaces. The 13 American colonies had been loyal, productive outposts of the British Empire for decades, yet beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. How did these colonies, bound to Britain by law and loyalty, come to seek independence? The answer lies in a complex web of politics, economics, culture, and ideology that unfolded over more than a decade. The story begins with the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, part of a larger global conflict known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. The British emerged victorious, but victory came at a staggering cost. The war left Britain deeply in debt and controlling vast territories in North America that required governance and protection. To fund the empire, Britain turned to the colonies, imposing taxes on goods, trade, and even everyday paper documents. The Sugar Act of 1764 taxed imported molasses, while the Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to pay for official stamps on legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards. For many colonists, these taxes were not just inconvenient, they were a violation of what they considered their fundamental rights, representation in government. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," quickly became a rallying cry. In towns and cities across the colonies, local leaders, merchants, and ordinary citizens debated the limits of British authority. Patrick Henry, a young lawyer in Virginia, famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." The Sons of Liberty, a secret society, organized protests and intimidated tax collectors, showing that resistance could be effective. These acts were not merely rebellious, they were statements of political philosophy, that government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. Tensions escalated further with the Townshend Acts of 1767, taxing imported items like glass, lead, paint, and tea. Colonists responded with widespread boycotts, refusing to import British goods. Boston, the nerve center of dissent, became a powder keg. British troops were stationed in the city to enforce laws, creating friction with local citizens. On March 5, 1770, a confrontation known as the Boston Massacre left 5 colonists dead, inflaming anti-British sentiment and solidifying resistance in public opinion. In 1773, the Tea Act gave the struggling British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. In protest, a bold act of defiance took place, the Boston Tea Party. Colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor, sending a dramatic message to Britain and inspiring similar protests across the colonies. The British responded with the coercive acts, closing Boston Harbor, restricting local governance, and permitting British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England. Far from intimidating the colonies, these measures united them. By 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Delegates from 12 colonies met to coordinate a collective response, debating petitions, boycotts, and military preparations. The stage was set for a larger conflict, but many still hoped for reconciliation. Could diplomacy prevent war, or was bloodshed inevitable? The answer came in April 1775 in the villages of Lexington and Concord, where colonial militias confronted British troops attempting to seize weapons and gunpowder. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out, and a new chapter in world history had begun. One defined not only by military action, but by ideas, courage, and the unyielding pursuit of liberty. April 19, 1775. A quiet morning in Massachusetts erupted into history. In Lexington, 77 Minutemen faced British soldiers, muskets at the ready, their nerves taut. Who fired first remains a mystery, but the result was devastating. 8 colonists fell, a shocking bloodletting that marked the first violence of a revolution. The confrontation quickly moved to Concord, where American militias, better prepared and reinforced, inflicted heavy casualties on the British troops. As the Redcoats retreated toward Boston, they were ambushed along narrow country roads, suffering losses that shocked even the seasoned soldiers of the British Army. The shot heard round the world had been fired, and the colonies could no longer claim mere loyalty, they were in open rebellion. News of these battles spread like wildfire. Across the colonies, committees of correspondence and local militias mobilized. Ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, and artisans took up arms alongside experienced soldiers. Yet as passionate as the colonists were, they faced a formidable foe. The British Empire, with thousands of well-trained, well-equipped troops ready to suppress the rebellion. To meet this threat, the colonies needed leadership and organization. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Delegates from all 13 colonies debated how to respond to escalating violence. Some advocated reconciliation, hoping Britain might repeal the taxes and restrictions that had ignited the conflict. Others, like John Adams, argued forcefully for full independence. Amid these debates, Congress appointed George Washington, a Virginian and veteran of the French and Indian War, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington was not just a military leader. He embodied the unity of the colonies, bringing together New England militias and Southern forces in a single, coordinated effort. The Revolution quickly escalated. In June 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill unfolded just outside Boston. Colonial forces, positioned on the hills overlooking the city, repelled two British assaults with determined fire. The colonists eventually withdrew due to ammunition shortages, but the cost to the British was staggering, over 1,000 casualties. The battle proved a crucial lesson. The revolutionaries could stand toe-to-toe with professional soldiers, and victory would not come easily for either side. While the armies clashed, a parallel battle for hearts and minds unfolded through ideas and pamphlets. Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant, published Common Sense in early 1776, cutting through cautious debates with a simple, radical message. Monarchy was obsolete, and independence was both logical and inevitable. Paine's words spread through taverns, printing presses, and homes, inspiring ordinary colonists to envision a nation free from British control. His writing transformed frustration into purpose and fear into collective resolve. By mid-1776, the revolution was no longer merely defensive. British forces had control of major cities like New York and Boston, yet the Continental Army, despite being poorly equipped, remained a symbol of hope. Washington's leadership emphasized strategy, patience, and the preservation of the army above all else. This principle would prove critical in the coming months, as the fledgling nation faced its greatest tests, including the treacherous winter ahead and the monumental task of declaring independence for the entire continent. The stage was set. Ordinary citizens were ready to become soldiers. Revolutionary ideas had taken root in every colony, and a single question loomed. Could these united, determined colonies, armed mostly with courage and conviction, defeat the most powerful military in the world? The answer would come in the summer of 1776, with a document that would echo across centuries, the Declaration of Independence. The summer of 1776 was more than a season of heat, it was a season of destiny. The colonies had endured years of political tension, protests, and small-scale skirmishes, but now the question of independence could no longer be postponed. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, a document that would reverberate far beyond the Atlantic world. Penned primarily by Thomas Jefferson, its words boldly proclaimed that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. The Declaration was more than a statement of principle. It was a challenge, a call to arms, and a framework for a new society. Ordinary colonists, inspired by its message, embraced the idea that their struggle was not just political but moral. Every militia, every town meeting, and every printed pamphlet became part of a revolutionary ecosystem, spreading ideas of liberty and resistance across the colonies. But ideals alone could not win the war. The Continental Army, still inexperienced and under-equipped, now faced the daunting task of confronting the British Empire directly. In the summer and fall of 1776, the New York campaign became the first major test. British forces, commanded by General William Howe, landed tens of thousands of troops on Long Island. Outnumbered and outgunned, Washington's army suffered defeat at the Battle of Brooklyn, narrowly escaping annihilation thanks to a daring nighttime retreat across the East River. The Continental Army's survival was a triumph in itself, proving that strategic patience and disciplined withdrawals could offset the British advantage in numbers and training. Winter, however, brought despair and a renewed challenge. Morale was low, enlistments were expiring, and supplies were scarce. Washington understood that bold action was necessary to maintain confidence in the army and the revolutionary cause. On December 25, 1776, he led 2,400 men across the icy Delaware River, launching a surprise attack on Hessian mercenaries stationed at Trenton, New Jersey. The victory was swift and decisive, revitalizing American morale. Less than a week later, Washington won again at Princeton, demonstrating not just courage but brilliant tactical foresight. Meanwhile, the revolution's success depended not only on battlefield victories, but on diplomacy and alliances. The American victory at Saratoga in 1777, where General Horatio Gates, aided by Benedict Arnold, forced the surrender of a large British army, proved pivotal. The battle showcased American ingenuity and determination, while sending a powerful signal abroad. The colonies could stand against Britain. This triumph convinced France to commit openly to the revolutionary cause, sending troops, ships, and supplies that would become decisive in the years to come. Amid the conflict, the war's ideological dimension continued to grow. Pamphlets, newspapers, and letters carried the revolutionary message from urban centers to frontier settlements. Figures like John Adams, Samuel Adams, and Benjamin Franklin shaped the moral and political argument for independence, ensuring that the revolution was not merely a military struggle, but a profound transformation of society's understanding of governance, rights, and the role of citizens. By the end of 1777, the fledgling United States had proven something remarkable. Ordinary citizens, armed with conviction, leadership, and a shared vision, could challenge the most powerful empire in the world. Yet the road ahead remained perilous. Harsh winters, logistical shortages, and a formidable enemy loomed. The next chapter, Valley Forge, Southern campaigns, and the French alliance, would test the resilience and ingenuity of the Continental Army like never before. How does an army survive when it has no shoes, little food, and winter closes in like an enemy of its own? In December 1777, the Continental Army marched into Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, not for battle, but for survival. Nearly 12,000 soldiers constructed crude huts from logs and mud as snow blanketed the landscape. Supplies were desperately short. Many soldiers wrapped rags around their feet to march through ice and mud. Disease, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia swept through the camp, claiming thousands of lives. It was a moment when the revolution seemed fragile, when the dream of independence flickered in the cold wind. Yet Valley Forge did not break the army, it transformed it. A Prussian military officer, Baron Friedrich von Steuben, arrived with a gift the Americans desperately needed: discipline and training. Speaking little English, von Steuben drilled the troops relentlessly, teaching them European battlefield tactics, proper formations, and the efficient use of bayonets. By the time spring arrived, the ragged force that had stumbled into Valley Forge emerged as a more professional, coordinated army, capable of facing British regulars on equal footing. While Washington rebuilt his army, events across the Atlantic reshaped the war. The American victory at Saratoga had convinced France that the revolutionaries had a real chance of success. In 1778, France formally entered the war as an ally of the United States. This was no small development. French ships, soldiers, money, and supplies now supported the American cause, transforming a colonial rebellion into an international conflict. Britain, once confident in its ability to crush the uprising, now faced a global war stretching from North America to the Caribbean and the seas of Europe. The British responded with a new strategy. Recognizing the difficulty of subduing the northern colonies, they shifted their focus to the south, believing that loyalist support there would allow them to regain control. In 1780, British forces captured Charleston, South Carolina, one of the worst American defeats of the war. Cities fell, and British commanders hoped Southern loyalists would rally to the crown. But the Southern campaign turned into a brutal, drawn-out struggle. American leaders like General Nathanael Greene adopted a strategy of mobility and harassment, rather than direct confrontation. Greene famously divided his forces, forcing the British to chase smaller American units across vast distances. Battles at Cowpens, Kings Mountain, and Guilford Courthouse inflicted heavy losses on British troops. Though not always clear American victories, these engagements exhausted British strength and morale. The war in the South became a war of attrition, where endurance mattered more than spectacle. Militia fighters, familiar with the terrain, used guerrilla tactics to disrupt British supply lines. Local knowledge, determination, and decentralized resistance made the region impossible to pacify. The British found themselves winning towns, but losing control of the countryside. Meanwhile, the French alliance grew more tangible. French naval power in the Atlantic limited British movement, and French troops prepared to join American forces in decisive operations. The revolution was no longer an isolated colonial struggle. It had become a carefully coordinated international effort. By 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis marched his army into Virginia, believing he could secure a decisive position along the coast. Instead, he was walking into a trap. Washington, now commanding a disciplined army supported by French allies, saw an opportunity to end the war in a single, decisive blow. As American and French forces converged on the small port town of Yorktown, a question hung in the air. After years of sacrifice, hunger, loss, and relentless struggle, could this be the moment that finally forced the British Empire to concede defeat? What does victory look like after 6 years of exhaustion, sacrifice, and uncertainty? In the late summer of 1781, the small coastal town of Yorktown, Virginia, became the focal point of a global conflict. British General Charles Cornwallis had fortified his position there, expecting support from the Royal Navy and believing the location defensible. What he did not realize was that American and French forces were already moving into place with remarkable coordination. General George Washington, working closely with French General Comte de Rochambeau, executed a bold plan. Rather than attacking British positions in New York, Washington secretly marched his army south over hundreds of miles. Meanwhile, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, blocking British naval reinforcements. Cornwallis was now trapped, cut off by land and sea. By September, approximately 17,000 American and French troops surrounded Yorktown. Artillery batteries were constructed, and a relentless bombardment began. Day and night cannon fire rained down on British defenses, slowly destroying fortifications and morale. The siege tightened as Allied forces dug trenches closer and closer to British lines. One of the most dramatic moments came with the assault on redoubts 9 and 10, key defensive positions protecting Yorktown. American troops, led by Alexander Hamilton, stormed Redoubt 10 in a daring nighttime attack, using bayonets to maintain silence. The French simultaneously captured Redoubt 9. With these positions lost, Cornwallis's situation became hopeless. On October 19, 1781, British drums beat a slow, somber rhythm as red-coated soldiers marched out of Yorktown and laid down their weapons. The image was unforgettable. The mighty British army surrendering to a coalition of former colonists and their European allies. Although minor skirmishes would continue elsewhere, Yorktown effectively ended major combat operations in North America. The news crossed the Atlantic with stunning effect. In Britain, public support for the war collapsed. Parliament, weary of the costly conflict, pushed for peace negotiations. For the American colonies, the victory at Yorktown was not just military, it was symbolic proof that independence was within reach. Formal negotiations began in Paris in 1782. American diplomats, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, worked skillfully to secure favorable terms. The resulting Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, officially recognized the independence of the United States. Britain ceded vast territories stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, granting the new nation immense potential for expansion. Yet victory brought new challenges. The war had united the colonies against a common enemy, but peace exposed deep divisions. The Continental Army disbanded, soldiers returned to farms and towns, and the fledgling government faced financial crisis and political uncertainty. The Articles of Confederation, the first governing document, proved too weak to manage the needs of a growing nation. Still, the revolution had achieved what once seemed impossible. 13 colonies had defied the most powerful empire on Earth and emerged as an independent republic. The ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence, Liberty, Equality, and Self-Governance had survived the test of war. But a new question now loomed. How would these former colonies transform from a loose alliance into a stable, functioning nation, capable of preserving the freedoms they had fought so hard to win? What happens after a revolution is won, but the nation it created is not yet strong enough to survive? When the guns fell silent in 1783, the United States faced a challenge just as daunting as war. Building a functioning country from 13 independent-minded states. The Articles of Confederation, drafted during the conflict, had served as a temporary framework. But now, in peace, its weaknesses became painfully clear. Congress had no power to tax, no authority to regulate trade between states, and no executive branch to enforce its laws. The nation was free but dangerously fragile. Economic chaos spread quickly. States printed their own currencies, trade disputes erupted across borders, and war debts mounted, with no reliable way to pay them. Veterans of the Continental Army returned home to find promissory notes instead of wages. Farmers, burdened by taxes and loans, faced foreclosure and imprisonment. The unrest came to a head in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. Led by former soldier Daniel Shays, angry farmers shut down courts to prevent land seizures. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but it sent shockwaves through the political leadership. If the government could not maintain order within a single state, how could it preserve the Union? Leaders like George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton recognized that the revolutionary victory would mean little without a stronger national structure. In May 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for what was originally intended to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they chose to design an entirely new system of government. Behind closed doors at the Constitutional Convention, intense debates unfolded. Large states and small states argued over representation. Northern and southern states clashed over issues of slavery and taxation. Compromises emerged from necessity. The Great Compromise created a bicameral legislature, with proportional representation in the House and equal representation in the Senate. The painful 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as partial representation for taxation and political balance, embedding a moral contradiction into the nation's foundation. The resulting United States Constitution established a system of checks and balances between three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, designed to prevent tyranny while enabling effective governance. Power was divided between federal and state authorities in a careful balance known as federalism. But ratifying the Constitution was not easy. Critics, known as anti-federalists, feared that a strong central government would threaten individual liberties. In response, supporters known as Federalists, including Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, wrote the influential Federalist Papers, explaining and defending the new system. To secure ratification, the framers promised the addition of a Bill of Rights to protect freedoms such as speech, religion, and fair trial. With this assurance, the Constitution was ratified in 1788. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. The revolution that had begun with musket fire in Lexington now culminated in the peaceful transfer of power under a written constitution, a rare achievement in the history of revolutions. The American Revolution had not only won independence, it had produced a new model of governance that would influence movements for freedom around the world. But the legacy of the revolution did not end with Washington's inauguration. Its ideas, liberty, equality, representation, and rights, would echo across continents, inspiring future generations to challenge oppression and reimagine what government could be. Can words be as powerful as weapons? Can ideas outlive armies? The American Revolution was not fought only with muskets and cannon fire. It was fought in pamphlets, in letters, in town halls, and in the minds of ordinary people. Long before independence was declared, a powerful current of thought had been flowing from Europe into the colonies. Ideas from the Enlightenment that questioned authority, championed reason, and redefined the relationship between rulers and the ruled. Thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that government existed to serve the people, not the other way around. Locke's concept of natural rights, life, liberty, and property deeply influenced Thomas Jefferson's phrasing in the Declaration of Independence. Montesquieu's idea of separated powers shaped the structure of the Constitution. These were not abstract theories. They became the intellectual backbone of a revolution. In colonial America, literacy rates were unusually high, and printing presses were widespread. Pamphlets like Common Sense by Thomas Paine sold in astonishing numbers, reaching farmers, laborers, and merchants alike. Political debate was no longer confined to elites. It was public, passionate, and participatory. Taverns became informal classrooms where ideas of liberty were discussed late into the night. The revolution also reshaped the meaning of citizenship. For the first time, ordinary men began to see themselves not as subjects of a king, but as active participants in governance. Town meetings, local assemblies, and state legislatures flourished with unprecedented engagement. The idea that government required the consent of the governed became a living principle, rather than a distant ideal. Yet the revolution's intellectual legacy was filled with contradictions. The Declaration proclaimed that all men are created equal, but slavery remained entrenched in many states. Women contributed significantly to the war effort, running farms, managing businesses, and supporting troops, yet they were denied political rights. Native American nations, caught between British and American forces, often found their lands and sovereignty threatened, regardless of the outcome. These contradictions did not go unnoticed. In fact, they planted seeds for future reform movements. Enslaved people heard the language of liberty and began to question their bondage. Women like Abigail Adams famously urged leaders to remember the ladies when forming new laws. Native leaders negotiated carefully, aware that a new nation might bring new dangers. Internationally, the American Revolution became a beacon. In France, soldiers who had fought alongside Americans returned home inspired by Republican ideals. Within a decade, France would experience its own revolution. Across Latin America, leaders like Simón Bolívar would later cite the American example when fighting for independence from Spain. The notion that a colony could successfully overthrow a powerful empire altered global expectations forever. The revolution also redefined the role of written constitutions. Instead of relying on tradition or monarchy, the United States built its government on a single codified document. This model would be copied by nations around the world seeking stability and legitimacy through law. By the late 1780s, It was clear that the American Revolution had achieved more than independence. It had reshaped political thought on a global scale, demonstrating that government by the people was not only imaginable but achievable. But if the revolution inspired so many, it also left a pressing question unresolved. How would this new nation confront the contradictions between its ideals and its realities in the years to come? What did the revolution feel like for the people who lived through it? Not as leaders or generals, but as ordinary human beings. For most Americans, the revolution was not a series of famous battles or political declarations. It was a daily struggle for survival in a world turned upside down. Farms became battlefields. Towns changed hands. Families were divided by loyalty, fear, and uncertainty. The Continental Army was not composed of professional soldiers, but of farmers, blacksmiths, laborers, and young apprentices. Many had never traveled far from home before the war. They marched long distances with inadequate supplies, often lacking proper uniforms, shoes, or blankets. Rations were inconsistent, sometimes reduced to little more than flour and water. Disease claimed more lives than combat. Letters home reveal exhaustion, homesickness, and determination in equal measure. Civilians faced their own hardships. British and American armies alike requisitioned food, livestock, and shelter. Inflation soared as paper currency lost value. Women took on expanded roles, running farms and businesses while husbands and sons were away. Some followed the army camps as cooks, nurses, and caretakers, becoming known as camp followers, vital, yet often overlooked participants in the war effort. Loyalists, colonists who remained faithful to Britain lived in constant danger. They faced harassment, confiscation of property, and sometimes violent retribution from patriot neighbors. Tens of thousands fled to Canada, the Caribbean, or back to Britain after the war, becoming refugees of a revolution they had not supported. For enslaved Africans, the war brought both hope and tragedy. The British promised freedom to enslaved people who escaped rebel masters and joined their side. Thousands did so, forming units like the Ethiopian Regiment. Others served in the Continental Army, especially in northern states, where some were granted freedom in exchange for service. Yet for many, the end of the war did not bring liberty. Slavery remained deeply rooted, particularly in the South. Native American nations experienced the revolution as a fight for their own survival. Many allied with the British, believing that British policies offered better protection against colonial expansion. When the United States won independence, native lands became increasingly vulnerable to settlement and displacement. The revolution marked the beginning of a new and difficult era for indigenous peoples. Children grew up amid gunfire and uncertainty. Schools closed, trade halted. Entire communities lived under occupation for months or years at a time. Diaries from the period describe the fear of hearing distant cannon fire, the anxiety of rumors spreading through towns, and the relief when familiar faces returned home from war. Yet amid hardship, a new sense of identity began to form. People who had once identified primarily with their colony, Virginian, New Yorker, Massachusetts farmer, began to think of themselves as Americans. Shared sacrifice created shared purpose. The revolution was not only fought in grand strategies and famous speeches. It lived in the daily endurance of millions whose names are not recorded in history books, but whose resilience made independence possible. And as these ordinary people rebuilt their lives after the war, they carried with them a powerful question. How could the new nation honor the sacrifices they had made and fulfill the promises of liberty that had inspired them to endure so much? Was the American Revolution truly a simple struggle between patriots and the British Empire? Or was it a far more complex civil war with global consequences? Inside the colonies, the population was deeply divided. Historians estimate that as many as one-third of Americans remained loyalists, faithful to the British crown. These were not strangers or outsiders. They were neighbors, merchants, farmers, and even family members of those fighting for independence. In cities like New York and Philadelphia, loyalist sentiment was particularly strong, creating communities where suspicion and tension simmered constantly. Patriot committees often monitored loyalist activities, confiscated property, and demanded oaths of allegiance. In some regions, violence broke out between civilians long before armies arrived. The revolution, in many places, resembled a civil war as much as a colonial rebellion. For Native American nations, the war was not about independence from Britain. It was about survival. Many tribes, including the Iroquois Confederacy, sided with the British because British authorities had previously attempted to limit colonial expansion westward with the Proclamation Line of 1763. American victory, they feared, would unleash waves of settlement into their lands. The result was devastating. Campaigns such as the Sullivan Expedition of 1779 deliberately destroyed Iroquois villages and crops, aiming to break native resistance. When the war ended, the Treaty of Paris made no mention of native rights or territories. Lands that had belonged to indigenous nations for centuries were now claimed by the United States without negotiation. The revolution also unfolded on a global stage. When France entered the war in 1778, Spain and the Dutch Republic later joined against Britain. Fighting erupted in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, along European coastlines, and even in India. British resources were stretched thin across the world. In the Caribbean, French and British fleets clashed over valuable sugar islands. In the Gulf Coast, Spanish forces under Bernardo de Galvez captured British forts along the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico, weakening Britain's ability to resupply its North American forces. The war for American independence had become part of a larger international struggle for imperial dominance. This global conflict played a crucial role in the outcome of the revolution. Without French naval power at Yorktown, Cornwallis might have escaped. Without Spanish pressure in the South, British resources might have been concentrated more effectively. American independence was achieved not in isolation, but through a web of international alliances and rivalries. Even within Britain, the war sparked intense political debate. Many British citizens questioned the cost and purpose of suppressing the colonies. By the early 1780s, public opinion had shifted significantly, contributing to Parliament's willingness to negotiate peace. The American Revolution, therefore, was not simply a tale of colonists versus empire. It was a layered conflict involving civil strife, indigenous survival, enslaved people seeking freedom, and global powers competing for advantage. As the war ended and the new United States emerged, it carried the weight of these complexities. Independence had been achieved, but at a cost that extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping the lives of millions across continents. How do you transform a victorious rebellion into a stable republic without losing the spirit that made the victory possible? When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the United States stood at the edge of an enormous opportunity and an equally enormous uncertainty. The war had united the colonies, but peace revealed how different they truly were. Economies varied from north to south. Political interests clashed, and loyalties to individual states often outweighed loyalty to the new nation. The Articles of Confederation had helped coordinate the war effort, but now its limitations threatened the country's survival. Congress could not compel states to contribute funds. It could not regulate interstate trade. It had no standing army to enforce laws. The government depended entirely on the voluntary cooperation of states that often disagreed with one another. Financial crisis loomed. The war had left heavy debts owed to foreign nations like France and the Netherlands, as well as to American soldiers and suppliers. With no power to tax, Congress struggled to make payments. Paper money lost value rapidly, creating inflation that hurt farmers and merchants alike. In western regions, settlers pushed beyond the Appalachian Mountains into territories claimed by Native American nations. Without a strong federal authority, conflicts flared that the government could neither control nor resolve effectively. The promise of vast lands brought hope for expansion, but also the danger of instability. One of the most alarming signs of weakness came in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion. Armed farmers in Massachusetts, angry over debt and taxation, shut down courts to prevent foreclosures. The rebellion was suppressed by a state militia funded by private merchants, not by the national government. To many leaders, this was a warning. The revolution had replaced British rule with a government too weak to maintain order. Prominent figures like George Washington, who had hoped to retire peacefully to Mount Vernon, watched these developments with concern. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton began advocating for a stronger national framework that could preserve liberty while ensuring stability. Meanwhile, debates over the meaning of the revolution continued. Some believed the states should remain nearly independent, guarding against centralized power. Others argued that without unity, the nation would fracture or fall prey to foreign influence. The central question was clear. How could Americans create a government strong enough to function, yet limited enough to protect the freedoms they had fought for? These tensions set the stage for one of the most important gatherings in American history. In 1787, delegates would meet in Philadelphia, not merely to revise the Articles of Confederation, but to design a new system of governance from the ground up. The war for independence had ended. Now began the equally challenging task of defining what independence truly meant in practice. Can a group of former revolutionaries, wary of centralized power, design a government strong enough to survive, without becoming the very tyranny they overthrew? In May 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they were there to amend the Articles of Confederation. Unofficially, many arrived with a far more ambitious goal: to create an entirely new system of government. The meetings were held in strict secrecy inside the Pennsylvania State House. Windows were shut despite the summer heat. Guards stood outside. The delegates understood the gravity of their task. If news spread that they were attempting to replace the existing government, public backlash could be swift and destabilizing. At the center of the convention stood figures whose names had already become legendary. George Washington, chosen unanimously to preside; James Madison, whose detailed notes would later reveal the debates; Benjamin Franklin, elder statesman and voice of compromise; and Alexander Hamilton, passionate advocate for strong federal authority. The first major conflict arose between large and small states. Large states like Virginia wanted representation based on population. Smaller states like New Jersey feared being overshadowed. The solution, known as the Great Compromise, created a two-house legislature: the House of Representatives based on population and the Senate, where each state would have equal representation. Another painful debate centered on slavery. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted fully for representation, while northern states objected. The grim 3/5 compromise was reached, counting enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation. This compromise kept the Union intact, but embedded a profound moral contradiction into the nation's founding document. The delegates then tackled the structure of government itself. They rejected monarchy but feared unchecked democracy. Their solution was a system of checks and balances. Power would be divided among three branches: legislative to make laws, executive to enforce them, and judicial to interpret them. Each branch would limit the others, preventing any single group from gaining too much authority. The concept of federalism was equally crucial. Some powers would belong to the national government, such as regulating trade and conducting foreign policy, while others would remain with the states. This balance aimed to preserve local control while ensuring national unity. By September 1787, the Constitution was complete. It was shorter than many expected but carefully constructed. When the delegates signed it, Benjamin Franklin famously remarked that he had often looked at the sun carved into Washington's chair and wondered whether it was rising or setting. Now he believed it was rising. But the Constitution was only a proposal. It would need to be ratified by the states, and the debate over its merits would become one of the most intense political struggles in American history. The Revolution had overthrown a king. Now, Americans had to decide whether this new framework of government could truly protect the liberty they had fought so hard to achieve. Would the people who had just fought a war against centralized authority now accept a stronger national government? After the Constitution was signed in September 1787, it did not automatically become law. It was sent to the states for ratification, and what followed was an intense, nationwide debate that reached into newspapers, taverns, town halls, and private homes. Supporters of the Constitution became known as Federalists. They argued that without a stronger central government, the United States would collapse into chaos or fall prey to foreign powers. Leading voices like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers, explaining how the new system would preserve liberty while ensuring stability. Opponents, called anti-federalists, feared that the Constitution gave too much power to the national government. They worried that a president might become a new kind of king, and that citizens' rights were not explicitly protected. Their concerns resonated with many Americans who remembered the abuses of British rule. The central issue became the protection of individual liberties. Anti-federalists demanded a clear list of rights that the government could never violate. Federalists initially argued that such a list was unnecessary, since the government only had powers specifically granted to it. But to secure ratification, a compromise was made. A Bill of Rights would be added after the Constitution was adopted. State by state, conventions debated the document. Some ratified quickly. Others, like Massachusetts and Virginia, approved only after being assured that amendments would follow. By June 1788, the required 9 states had ratified the Constitution, making it the new law of the land. In 1789, the first federal elections were held. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States, a powerful symbol of unity and trust. John Adams became vice president. The new government began its work in New York City, before later moving to Philadelphia, and eventually Washington, D.C. True to the promise made during ratification, James Madison introduced a series of amendments in Congress. 10 of these were adopted in 1791 as the Bill of Rights. guaranteeing freedoms such as speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to a fair trial. These amendments addressed many of the fears raised during the ratification debates and strengthened public confidence in the new system. For the first time in modern history, a nation had deliberately designed a government through written law, debate, and compromise, rather than inheritance or conquest. The revolution had begun with resistance to taxation and imperial authority. It ended with the peaceful establishment of a constitutional republic based on representation and rights. The United States now faced the future, not as a collection of rebellious colonies, but as a functioning nation. Yet, the true test of the revolution's success would not be measured only by independence or governance, but by how faithfully the country would uphold the principles it had declared to the world. How does a revolution change the lives of ordinary people, beyond politics and armies? The American Revolution did more than overthrow a monarchy, it reshaped society. Citizens began to see themselves as participants in a national experiment, not just subjects of distant rulers. Ideas of equality and personal liberty slowly permeated daily life, though unevenly. Women played crucial roles during the war and afterward. Figures like Abigail Adams and Martha Washington not only managed households and farms in their husbands' absence, but also influenced political thought through letters and counsel. The phrase, "remember the ladies," became a cautionary, yet revolutionary reminder that women sought recognition for their contributions, even if they remained excluded from formal political power. The revolution also prompted gradual change in education and civic participation. Schools and colleges expanded curricula to include lessons on governance, civic responsibility, and the new nation's history. Public debate and discussion became central to civic life, as citizens learned to weigh ideas and form opinions on issues that once belonged solely to elites. For African Americans, the revolution was both a moment of hope and frustration. In northern states, slavery began to decline, and manumission became more common. Enslaved people who fought for freedom, particularly in the British and American armies, forced society to confront the contradictions of liberty and bondage. Yet in the southern states, slavery largely persisted, sowing the seeds of future conflict. Native Americans, on the other hand, experienced a sharp reversal. Lands they had inhabited for centuries were ceded to the new United States without negotiation. Many tribes were displaced, and their political power in North America was dramatically reduced, a tragic consequence of American independence that would unfold over decades. Culturally, the revolution fostered a sense of American identity. Shared symbols, the flag, songs, and national heroes began to emerge. The celebration of independence and the stories of ordinary patriots and soldiers became foundational myths, binding citizens across regional and social divides. Economically, the war disrupted trade, but also encouraged domestic production. Colonists became more self-reliant, creating the beginnings of an internal economy less dependent on Britain. Commerce, banking, and manufacturing slowly grew, laying the groundwork for the nation's expansion. Even in international affairs, the revolution set a precedent. Other nations watched with awe and skepticism. The idea that a people could overthrow an empire and establish a government based on law and consent inspired movements in France, Haiti, and Latin America. The American Revolution became a global symbol of the potential of human self-determination. Yet the revolution's ideals remained incomplete. Full equality, racial justice, and women's political rights would take decades, sometimes centuries, to approach. Nevertheless, the revolution marked the beginning of a profound social transformation, embedding principles that would guide future generations. And as the new nation moved forward, the question persisted. Could the United States live up to the lofty ideals of liberty, equality, and justice it had fought to achieve, or would the contradictions of its society limit its promise? Was the American Revolution just a local rebellion, or did it spark a wave that would change the world? From the very beginning, the revolution was tied to global politics. Britain was not fighting a rebellion in isolation. It was defending an empire that stretched across continents. The entry of France in 1778, followed by Spain and the Dutch Republic, transformed the war into a worldwide struggle for influence. French funding, troops, and naval power were decisive, particularly at Yorktown, while Spain and the Netherlands engaged Britain elsewhere, stretching its resources thin. The ideological impact extended far beyond North America. In France, the American example inspired calls for liberty and reform. Soldiers returning from the colonies brought with them ideas of equality, citizenship, and popular sovereignty. Within a decade, these ideas contributed to the French Revolution, demonstrating how the American experiment had immediate global resonance. In Latin America, independence movements were sparked decades later. as leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martin looked to the American struggle as proof that colonial rule could be successfully challenged. The revolution became a blueprint for resistance, not just against Britain but against imperial domination worldwide. Even within Europe, the revolution challenged assumptions about monarchy, empire, and the rights of ordinary citizens. Philosophers, diplomats, and political thinkers debated the implications of the American model, influencing constitutions, legal reforms, and republican experiments in Italy, Poland, and beyond. The revolution also set precedents in warfare and diplomacy. It was one of the first modern conflicts where irregular militias, citizen armies, and ideological mobilization played as decisive a role as formal military engagements. The coordination between American revolutionaries and foreign allies demonstrated that diplomacy and military strategy were inseparable in achieving independence. For Britain, the loss of the 13 colonies forced a rethinking of imperial strategy. It shifted focus toward India, the Caribbean, and later Africa, signaling the start of a more globally cautious empire. Lessons learned in North America would influence British policy in subsequent colonial conflicts. The American Revolution was not merely a historical event confined to one continent. It reshaped global perceptions of power, governance, and human rights. It proved that an insurgent population, inspired by ideas and coordinated alliances, could challenge the most formidable empire of the 18th century. And yet, even as the world watched, the new United States faced its own unresolved dilemmas. Could it reconcile its revolutionary ideals with its social inequalities? And could it survive as a durable, united nation in a complex international environment? The answers would unfold in the decades that followed. Who were the people behind this monumental upheaval? Were they extraordinary individuals, ordinary citizens, or both? The American Revolution was driven by a mix of visionary leaders, brilliant strategists, and countless ordinary people, whose names would never be recorded in history books. George Washington, revered for his steadiness, leadership, and moral authority, held the Continental Army together through retreat, winter, and defeat. Without his guidance, the fledgling army might have dissolved entirely. Benjamin Franklin, diplomat and philosopher, worked tirelessly abroad to secure French support, navigating international politics with unmatched skill. Thomas Jefferson articulated the ideals of liberty and equality in the Declaration of Independence, giving the revolution a moral and philosophical foundation that inspired both soldiers and civilians. Other figures shaped the revolution in crucial ways. John Adams pushed for independence in Congress, balancing diplomacy with political insight. Alexander Hamilton and Marquis de Lafayette brought military brilliance and energy that amplified the effectiveness of American forces. Benedict Arnold, whose early heroism at Saratoga was later overshadowed by treason, reminds us of the human complexity of war, where loyalty, ambition, and personal grievances intersect. Yet the revolution was also made by ordinary patriots, farmers, artisans, women, and enslaved people who fought, supported, and sustained the war effort. The Sons of Liberty organized protests, boycotts, and acts of civil resistance that disrupted British authority. Women like Abigail Adams and Molly Pitcher challenged conventional roles, supporting armies, managing households, and in some cases taking up arms. Enslaved African Americans and free black soldiers leveraged the conflict to pursue freedom, while Native American nations sought to protect their lands and sovereignty. The war was a test of endurance, resilience, and courage. Every march, every siege, every winter encampment demanded sacrifice. Soldiers endured frostbite, hunger, and disease, while civilians lived with constant uncertainty. Their commitment to a vision of independence transformed abstract ideas into a tangible revolution. The collective effort of leaders and citizens illustrates a central truth. Revolutions are not just the product of great men or women, but of society mobilized around a shared purpose. The American Revolution became a story not only of battles and treaties, but of the human spirit, its capacity to endure, adapt, and imagine a new future. As the revolution concluded, these men and women faced a profound question. How would they translate the courage, sacrifice, and ideals that had won independence into the foundations of a lasting, just, and prosperous nation? How do you hold together 13 independent-minded states while creating a functioning national government? After independence, the United States faced the enormous task of turning revolutionary ideals into practical governance. The Articles of Confederation had allowed the colonies to fight and win the war, but in peace, its weaknesses became apparent. Congress could not levy taxes, regulate trade, or enforce laws. States often acted independently, sometimes in direct conflict with one another. The economic situation was precarious. War debts to foreign nations and domestic creditors loomed large. States issued their own currencies, creating confusion and inflation. Merchants and farmers struggled to recover from trade disruptions, and economic instability threatened to unravel the fragile union. These challenges sparked political debate. Some leaders, like Alexander Hamilton, argued for a strong national government to stabilize the economy, enforce treaties, and maintain security. Others, wary of centralized authority, insisted that power must remain with the states to prevent tyranny. These debates foreshadowed the rise of America's first political divisions, laying the foundation for the Federalist and Anti-Federalist movements. The Constitution of 1787 attempted to resolve these conflicts by creating a federal system. Authority was shared between the national government and the states. The legislative branch represented the people and the states, the executive branch enforced laws and oversaw foreign affairs, and the judicial branch interpreted the law. Checks and balances prevented any branch from dominating, while the Bill of Rights guaranteed individual freedoms. Even with a written framework, tensions persisted. States jealously guarded local authority, particularly in matters of taxation and militia organization. Political debates intensified over representation, commerce, and the balance between liberty and security. The young republic had to reconcile revolutionary ideals with the realities of governing a diverse, expansive territory. Early political life reflected these challenges. Federalists, led by Hamilton, favored a strong central government, commercial growth, and close ties with Britain. Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, emphasized agrarian democracy, state sovereignty, and closer relations with France. Newspapers, pamphlets, and political clubs became battlegrounds for these ideas, showing that the revolution's struggle for power had shifted from muskets to words and policy. The challenges of unity were not purely political. Social, economic, and geographic divisions complicated governance. Northern states differed sharply from Southern states in economy, culture, and attitudes toward slavery. Western territories demanded access to land and protection from Native American resistance. The new federal government had to balance these competing interests while ensuring national cohesion. By the early 1790s, the United States had survived its first test, creating a functioning government capable of enforcing laws, regulating commerce, and managing foreign relations. Yet the tensions between state and national authority and between differing visions of America's future would shape political life for decades. The revolution had succeeded in winning independence, but the challenge now was to build a nation that could survive and thrive in peace, proving that liberty without unity was fragile. How does a newly independent nation turn the promise of freedom into real space, opportunity, and security? The Treaty of Paris in 1783 had given the United States enormous territorial gains, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Yet possession on paper did not guarantee control on the ground. Settlers moving westward faced challenges: hostile terrain, Native American resistance, and uncertain legal authority. The western frontier became both a symbol of opportunity and a source of danger. Diplomacy was crucial. The new nation had to navigate relations with powerful neighbors. Britain maintained forts in the Great Lakes region and continued to influence native nations, limiting American expansion. Spain controlled the Mississippi River's mouth, crucial for trade, and initially restricted U.S. navigation. Negotiating access and securing borders required skilled diplomacy. Figures like John Jay and Thomas Pinckney played central roles, leading to treaties that established trade rights and territorial boundaries. Westward migration was not uniform. Settlers often traveled in small groups, along rivers and trails, facing isolation and the constant threat of attack. Native American nations, including the Shawnee, Cherokee, and Miami, resisted encroachment, leading to violent skirmishes known collectively as the Northwest Indian Wars. The U.S. government struggled to assert authority, highlighting the limits of the new federal system. Land policies sought to turn frontier claims into orderly settlement. The Land Ordinance of 1785 divided territories into townships for sale and development, establishing a blueprint for westward expansion. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 provided a process for creating new states and banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, setting an early precedent for federal authority over expansion. Expansion also had economic implications. Settlers sought fertile land to farm, while merchants and speculators looked for profit. Trade routes developed along rivers like the Ohio and Mississippi, and frontier towns began to emerge. Yet these developments often brought conflict, both with native nations and between competing settlers. Internationally, the United States had to maintain credibility as a sovereign nation. British interference in the West, Spanish control of key waterways, and French demands for repayment of wartime loans required careful negotiation. Washington's administration emphasized neutrality while asserting American rights, establishing precedents that would guide foreign policy for decades. By the end of the 1790s, the United States had begun to extend its reach beyond the Atlantic seaboard. Expansion brought opportunities, but also political, economic, and social challenges that tested the durability of the new republic. The frontier was not only a place of settlement. It was a proving ground for American governance, diplomacy, and the revolutionary ideals of liberty and independence. The revolution had ended with independence, but the challenge of building a nation stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The frontier posed the next question: could the United States grow without losing the unity and principles that had made victory possible? How does a revolution resonate long after the last shot is fired? The American Revolution did more than create a nation. It reshaped ideas about government, rights, and human potential across the globe. Politically, it proved that colonies could overthrow an empire and establish a functional government based on the consent of the governed. The principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution influenced countless movements worldwide, inspiring revolutions in France, Haiti, and Latin America. Domestically, the revolution reshaped society. Citizens began to see themselves as active participants in governance. The notion that people, not kings, legitimately held power permeated political culture. Education, civic engagement, and public debate expanded, creating a society increasingly aware of its rights and responsibilities. Yet, the revolution left unresolved tensions. Slavery remained entrenched in the South, even as northern states began gradual emancipation. Women gained visibility in public and political life, but formal political equality was still decades away. Native American nations suffered displacement and loss of sovereignty. These contradictions underscored that freedom and equality were ideals to pursue, not guaranteed outcomes. Economically, the revolution encouraged self-reliance. Americans began producing goods domestically, expanding trade networks, and developing commercial infrastructure independent of Britain. Land policies and westward migration created opportunities for social mobility, even as they caused conflict with native nations and created inequalities of their own. Internationally, the revolution demonstrated that ideas of liberty and democracy could travel across oceans. Enlightenment thought, once largely theoretical, became actionable. Governments could be held accountable, and citizens could assert rights without waiting for permission from monarchs or empires. The American example became a blueprint for future struggles against oppression, influencing constitutions, legal reforms, and revolutionary movements worldwide. The revolution also established long-term political frameworks. The system of federalism, separation of powers, and checks and balances created a durable government capable of adapting to new challenges. Political debate between Federalists and Republicans, between central authority and states' rights, became a normal and even necessary feature of American life. It proved that democratic systems could survive disagreement, compromise, and conflict. Culturally, the revolution created a shared national identity. Symbols like the flag, the Constitution, and the figure of George Washington helped unify citizens across geography and class. Stories of ordinary patriots, farmers, women, soldiers, and merchants became foundational myths, teaching future generations about courage, sacrifice, and the power of collective action. Even centuries later, the revolution's influence persists. Its principles continue to guide debates about liberty, equality, governance, and human rights. It reminds the world that political power is not immutable and that ordinary people can shape history. As the United States entered the 19th century, the legacy of the revolution would continue to challenge, inspire, and transform its people. The question remained ever relevant. Could the ideals of 1776, the promise of freedom, equality, and self-governance, ever be fully realized in a society still wrestling with its contradictions? How did a ragtag army of farmers and tradesmen defeat the most powerful military in the world? The American Revolution was won not only by ideals, but by strategy, terrain, and adaptability. Understanding the major battles and military strategies is essential to grasp the war's outcome. The conflict began with Lexington and Concord, April 1775, where colonial militias engaged British troops in a shot heard round the world. These skirmishes demonstrated that ordinary citizens could resist professional soldiers. Guerrilla-style tactics, knowledge of local terrain, and quick mobilization became hallmarks of early American strategy. The Siege of Boston, 1775-1776, followed. Under George Washington's command, artillery captured from Fort Ticonderoga was transported over rough terrain to Boston, forcing the British to evacuate. This early victory highlighted ingenuity and determination over sheer numbers. In the northern campaigns, the Battle of Saratoga, 1777, marked a turning point. American forces, under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, used terrain advantage and coordinated attacks to trap British General Burgoyne. Saratoga's victory convinced France to enter the war, dramatically shifting the global balance. The winter at Valley Forge, 1777-1778, while not a battle, was pivotal. Training under Baron von Steuben transformed the Continental Army into a disciplined, professional force, capable of executing complex maneuvers. This preparation paid dividends in later engagements. In the Southern Theater, battles like Cowpens, 1781, and Guilford Courthouse, 1781, showcased innovative tactics. General Nathanael Greene avoided direct confrontation when disadvantageous, instead using mobility, knowledge of the terrain, and militia forces to wear down British troops. The Battle of Cowpens, a textbook example of double envelopment, forced a decisive American victory. The Siege of Yorktown, 1781, combined land and naval operations in a coordinated strategy. American and French troops encircled Cornwallis, while the French fleet blocked the Chesapeake Bay. The capture of key redoubts and relentless artillery fire forced British surrender, effectively ending major combat operations. Throughout the war, American forces emphasized flexibility over rigid tactics, often retreating strategically to preserve manpower. Militia units harassed supply lines and conducted raids, while conventional forces engaged when advantageous. British commanders, accustomed to European-style set-piece battles, often underestimated the resilience and ingenuity of the Americans. Visualizing these battles is crucial for a documentary. Maps can show troop movements and geographic challenges. Archival sketches and paintings depict uniforms, artillery placements, and fortifications. Animated overlays illustrate encirclements, flanking maneuvers, and strategic retreats, helping viewers grasp why these engagements mattered. The Revolution's military history is not just a series of victories and defeats. It is a story of adaptation, leadership, and the interplay between strategy, environment, and morale. The success of the American cause depended on the ingenuity of commanders, the endurance of soldiers, and the support of civilians who kept the war effort alive. Even after Yorktown, minor skirmishes continued, reminding the new nation that victory in war was never simple, and that winning independence required more than just battlefield success. It required vision, coordination, and perseverance. The Revolution promised liberty, equality, and self-government, but for whom? While the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, the reality of 18th century America was far more complex. Slavery remained entrenched in the southern states. Tens of thousands of African Americans were enslaved, despite the rhetoric of freedom. Some fought for the British, enticed by promises of emancipation, while others joined the Continental Army with hopes of gaining freedom through service. Yet for most, emancipation remained distant, exposing a profound contradiction in the revolutionary ideals. Women, despite their indispensable contributions, faced limited political and legal rights. Figures like Abigail Adams urged the new government to remember the ladies, highlighting that women had sacrificed and worked tirelessly for independence. Women managed farms, ran businesses, and supported armies directly, but the revolution largely failed to translate their efforts into formal recognition or enfranchisement. Native American nations were deeply affected by the conflict. Many tribes, including the Iroquois Confederacy and the Cherokee, sided with the British, hoping to protect their lands from colonial expansion. The American victory, however, unleashed westward settlement and displacement, undermining native sovereignty and setting the stage for decades of conflict along the frontier. Even within the newly independent states, inequality persisted. Property requirements limited voting rights, and political participation was largely restricted to white men of certain means. While revolutionary ideals inspired debates on justice and rights, the social hierarchy of 18th century America meant that freedom was neither universal nor immediate. At the same time, the revolution planted seeds for change. Gradual emancipation in northern states, increased advocacy for women's education, and the growing visibility of native rights issues all emerged in the post-war years. Citizens began to recognize that independence was only the first step. The struggle for equality and justice would be ongoing. The tension between revolutionary ideals and social realities created a dual legacy. The revolution established principles that inspired future generations, yet it also revealed the limitations of liberty in a society still bound by entrenched hierarchies. This contradiction would fuel political debates, reform movements, and social struggles throughout the 19th century. Ultimately, the American Revolution was both a triumph and a challenge. It declared a radical vision of liberty and self-government, but left critical questions unresolved. Could the nation extend freedom to all its people? Could it reconcile ideals with practice? The answers would define the trajectory of the United States for generations to come. Could the American Revolution truly be contained within its own borders, or was it destined to inspire the world? The American Revolution reverberated far beyond North America, challenging monarchies, empires, and social hierarchies across the globe. In France, the revolution provided both inspiration and practical lessons. French officers who had fought alongside Americans, such as Marquis de Lafayette, returned home with first-hand experience of citizen armies, popular mobilization, and the principles of republican government. These lessons helped ignite the French Revolution in 1789, a decade after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In the Caribbean, the struggle for liberty intersected with the brutal realities of slavery. News of American independence spread rapidly among enslaved populations. And in Haiti, the ideas of equality and natural rights fueled the Haitian Revolution, 1791–1804. Enslaved Africans, led by Toussaint Louverture, leveraged these ideals to overthrow colonial rulers and establish the first independent Black republic, a direct echo of American revolutionary thought adapted to a vastly different context. Across Latin America, independence movements were inspired by the American example. Leaders like Simón Bolívar cited the success of the American colonies as evidence that colonial rule could be challenged and replaced with sovereign governments. Constitutions, treaties, and revolutionary rhetoric in countries from Venezuela to Argentina often referenced American ideals as a model for self-determination. Even in Europe, the revolution sparked debate among intellectuals and statesmen. Monarchies feared similar uprisings, while reformers pointed to the American case as proof that representative government and citizen rights were not mere theory, but achievable in practice. The American Revolution became a proof of concept. A modern state could emerge from rebellion without descending into chaos if carefully designed institutions and citizen participation were combined. Militarily, the revolution demonstrated the effectiveness of asymmetric strategies, citizen militias, and foreign alliances. The combination of political will, adaptable tactics, and strategic diplomacy became a model for later insurgencies worldwide. The American experience reshaped expectations of what colonized peoples, oppressed nations, and reform-minded societies could achieve. The revolution also revealed the limits of liberty. While the new United States inspired global movements, it simultaneously entrenched inequalities at home. Slavery persisted, women remained largely disenfranchised, and native peoples were dispossessed. Internationally, this paradox sparked reflection and debate. Could the ideals of liberty coexist with social and political exclusion? Ultimately, the American Revolution was a spark that lit the world. It demonstrated that ideas, when combined with courage, strategy, and commitment, could transcend borders and inspire generations. Yet, it also reminded the world that freedom was a continuous struggle, requiring vigilance, adaptation, and the reconciliation of ideals with reality. How did a revolution reshape not only politics and society, but the very economy of a nation? Before independence, the American colonies were deeply integrated into the British imperial economy. Trade regulations, taxes, and mercantilist policies limited local manufacturing and tied wealth to exports like tobacco, sugar, and timber. The revolution disrupted these patterns, forcing Americans to rethink economic survival and opportunity. War created both crisis and innovation. Blockades and interruptions in trade with Britain compelled colonists to develop domestic production. Farmers diversified crops, artisans increased local manufacturing, and merchants sought new trade partners, including France, the Caribbean, and the newly independent United States internal markets. This economic self-reliance strengthened the sense of national identity and demonstrated the colony's capacity for independence beyond politics. After the war, the new government faced the challenge of stabilizing the economy. Debt from the war, both domestic and international, threatened the survival of the fledgling nation. Under Alexander Hamilton's financial policies, the federal government assumed state debts, created a national bank, and established mechanisms for taxation and credit. These policies not only stabilized the economy, but also set precedents for federal economic authority and modern financial systems. Land became a central economic resource. The Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 facilitated orderly settlement, surveying, and sale of Western lands. These policies encouraged migration, agriculture, and local commerce, while establishing the framework for future states. Yet they also intensified conflicts with native nations who saw these lands as their own. Trade patterns shifted as well. American merchants increasingly engaged with European nations other than Britain. Ports like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York became hubs of commerce, connecting the Atlantic world to a new, independent America. Domestic industries such as ironworks, textiles, and shipbuilding expanded, laying the foundations for early American industrialization. Economic transformation was not universal. Rural regions faced hardship, debt crises, and uneven growth. Small farmers sometimes struggled to compete with wealthy landowners or merchant elites, highlighting continuing inequalities. Yet collectively, these changes marked a transition from a colonial economy dependent on Britain to a diverse, self-sustaining national economy. Visually, the documentary can illustrate this with maps showing trade routes, animation of Western land surveys, sketches of early factories, and images of farmers, artisans, and merchants adapting to a new economic reality. The American Revolution, therefore, did more than establish independence. It reshaped the material foundations of the nation. The interplay of war, diplomacy, policy, and human ingenuity created an economy capable of supporting the ideals of liberty, self-determination, and national growth. How do the battles for independence translate into the daily life of law, justice, and governance? The American Revolution did more than create a new government. It established a legal foundation that would shape the nation for centuries. The Constitution, ratified in 1788, created the framework for governance. But it was the subsequent development of courts, laws, and legal precedents that made these principles functional in everyday life. The judicial branch, led by the newly established Supreme Court, became a cornerstone of the revolutionary legacy. Under Chief Justice John Jay, early decisions reinforced federal authority while balancing state powers. Judicial review, later formalized in Marbury v. Madison, 1803, ensured that laws and executive actions could be checked against the Constitution, protecting citizens' rights and preserving the balance of power envisioned by the founders. State governments, newly independent from Britain, drafted constitutions reflecting revolutionary ideals. Most guaranteed freedom of speech, religion, and assembly. Property rights and legislative representation became central issues, linking legal frameworks directly to the Revolution's promise of equality and liberty. The Bill of Rights, 1791, codified protections that had been demanded during ratification debates. Freedoms of speech, press, religion, and assembly, as well as protections against unreasonable searches and cruel punishment, institutionalized the Revolution's ideological gains. Citizens now had enforceable rights that could limit government overreach, a radical innovation in the 18th century. Legal systems also reflected ongoing social tensions. Women and enslaved people remained largely excluded from legal equality, highlighting contradictions between ideals and practice. Native Americans were often treated as wards or external entities, leaving their sovereignty unrecognized in American courts. These gaps foreshadowed the long struggle for civil rights that would continue for centuries. Internationally, the Revolution's legal innovations influenced other nations' constitutions and legal codes. France, Spain, and Latin American countries observed how law could enshrine liberty, while maintaining order, inspiring constitutional experiments abroad. The American experience demonstrated that law could be both a tool of governance and a shield for citizen rights. Visual representation in a documentary could include sketches of early courtrooms, reenactments of legislative debates, animated sequences showing the separation of powers, and archival documents highlighting the Bill of Rights and state constitutions. Such imagery reinforces how abstract ideals were transformed into practical structures that governed society. The legal legacy of the Revolution is a reminder that independence was not only a matter of winning battles. It was about embedding principles of liberty, justice, and citizen rights into institutions that endure beyond the lifespan of any individual. How does a nation teach its citizens the meaning of liberty and ensure that revolutionary ideals endure beyond the battlefield? The American Revolution was not only a political and military struggle. It was also a cultural and intellectual revolution. Citizens needed to understand their rights, responsibilities, and the principles underlying the new nation. Education became a crucial tool for fostering civic identity and sustaining the republic. In the northern states, schools and academies expanded curricula to include lessons in government, history, and civic responsibility. Students studied the revolution itself, learning the stories of independence, the sacrifices of ordinary patriots, and the ideals of freedom and equality. Textbooks and pamphlets emphasized that citizenship required knowledge, participation, and moral virtue. Higher education also adapted. Colleges like Harvard, Yale, and the College of William and Mary integrated courses on law, political philosophy, and economics, producing a generation of leaders versed in the principles of Republican governance. New institutions, such as the University of North Carolina and Rutgers, were founded with similar goals: to cultivate an educated citizenry capable of sustaining democratic institutions. Cultural identity was shaped by commemorations, symbols, and public rituals. Independence Day celebrations, monuments, and memorials reinforced the narrative of liberty and national unity. Stories of heroism, like those of Molly Pitcher or soldiers at Saratoga, became part of a shared historical memory, creating a sense of common purpose across diverse communities. Literature, newspapers, and pamphlets also played a pivotal role. They disseminated revolutionary ideas, debated policies, and encouraged public participation. Writers and editors emphasized that the revolution was not a singular event, but an ongoing process, requiring citizens to remain vigilant and engaged. Despite progress, challenges remained. Women, enslaved people, and Native Americans largely remained excluded from formal education and political participation. Yet, the revolution planted seeds for future advocacy, inspiring movements for women's rights, abolition, and broader civic engagement in the decades to come. Visually, the documentary could show archival illustrations of schools, classrooms, and libraries, animated sequences of pamphlets circulating towns, and reenactments of public celebrations, giving viewers a sense of how revolutionary ideals were internalized and transmitted to the next generation. The transformation of education and culture illustrates that revolutions extend beyond battles and governments. By teaching citizens the principles of liberty, fostering civic identity, and creating shared cultural narratives, the American Revolution ensured that its ideas would continue to shape society long after independence was won. How could a nation claim liberty while millions remained enslaved? The American Revolution was founded on ideals of freedom and equality, yet slavery remained entrenched in much of the country, particularly in the South. This contradiction became one of the Revolution's most enduring dilemmas. While white colonists fought to escape tyranny, African Americans remained bound by law and custom, a stark reminder that liberty was unevenly applied. Some enslaved people seized the moment to pursue freedom. The British, hoping to destabilize the colonies, offered emancipation to those who joined their forces. Tens of thousands of African Americans took this opportunity, leaving their homes to fight for the promise of liberty under the Union Jack. Others joined the Continental Army, sometimes receiving freedom in exchange for service. These choices highlight that the Revolution was not just a struggle of colonists against Britain, but a broader contest over human rights and self-determination. Northern states gradually moved toward emancipation in the 1780s and 1790s, reflecting the influence of revolutionary ideals on social change. Pennsylvania passed the first gradual emancipation law in 1780, and similar measures followed in New York, New Jersey, and elsewhere. These laws created a legal framework for freedom, while balancing economic and political pressures, demonstrating the complex interplay between ideals and reality. In the South, however, slavery became even more entrenched. Tobacco and cotton economies relied on enslaved labor, and Southern leaders resisted abolition. The Three-Fifths Compromise, incorporated into the Constitution, counted enslaved individuals as three-fifths of a person for representation, further embedding slavery into the political structure of the new nation. Resistance to slavery, however, persisted. Enslaved Africans engaged in daily acts of defiance, from work slowdowns to escape. Religious movements such as the Quakers' abolitionist campaigns and the creation of African American communities highlighted growing opposition to the institution. These struggles reflected the broader tension between revolutionary ideals and social realities. Visually, the documentary can illustrate this segment with maps showing slave populations, images of Northern emancipation laws, archival depictions of African American soldiers, and animated graphics showing the Three-Fifths Compromise. Personal stories, such as those of soldiers or runaway enslaved individuals, humanize the contradictions of the Revolution and make the historical realities vivid for viewers. The Revolution's legacy regarding slavery is paradoxical. It inspired freedom and reform while simultaneously entrenching inequality. Understanding this contradiction is essential to grasping the complexity of the American experiment, freedom claimed but not fully extended, a tension that would continue to define the nation for generations. How did women shape the revolution, even when they were denied formal power? While men marched to battlefields, women maintained the revolutionary cause through resilience, leadership, and direct involvement. They managed farms, businesses, and households while husbands and sons were away, ensuring that communities and armies remained supplied. In some cases, women directly participated in combat or support roles. Molly Pitcher, for example, famously carried water to soldiers during the Battle of Monmouth and even operated a cannon when her husband fell. Political influence also came through correspondence and advocacy. Abigail Adams, writing to John Adams in 1776, famously implored him to remember the ladies when forming the new government. Her letters reflect both the moral authority and the political awareness women wielded, even without formal enfranchisement. Women across the colonies organized petitions, boycotts, and fundraising efforts, making their activism integral to the revolutionary effort. Education and literacy among women began to gain attention during this period. Figures such as Judith Sargent Murray argued for women's intellectual equality and the importance of education, laying early groundwork for debates over gender and civic participation. Schools for girls expanded in some regions, often emphasizing practical and moral instruction, but also creating a new sense of female agency within society. Yet, the revolution exposed limits. Women were largely excluded from voting, holding office, or participating formally in government. Revolutionary rhetoric celebrated liberty, but in practice, it applied almost exclusively to men. The question of women's rights remained unresolved, planting seeds for the early women's rights movements that would emerge in the 19th century. Visual elements for this segment could include archival illustrations of women at work, letters and documents from figures like Abigail Adams, and reenactments of women contributing to military and civic efforts. These depictions help viewers understand that the revolution was not only fought on battlefields, but also in homes, communities, and correspondence. The experience of women during the revolution underscores a critical lesson. Revolutions extend beyond formal political structures. They reshape society, challenge traditional roles, and inspire future generations to continue the struggle for equality. While the revolution did not grant women full rights, it opened conversations and opportunities that would influence American society for centuries. How did the revolution affect the people who had lived on the land long before the first colonists arrived? For Native American nations, the American Revolution was both a political and an existential crisis. Many tribes faced impossible choices: align with the British to resist colonial expansion, remain neutral, or attempt alliances with the revolutionary Americans. These decisions often had profound consequences for survival, land, and sovereignty. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, experienced internal divisions. Some nations, like the Mohawks under Joseph Brant, allied with the British, hoping to protect their lands from colonial encroachment. Others attempted neutrality, but neutrality often meant vulnerability. The war fractured traditional alliances, created internal conflict, and led to significant population losses. Southern tribes, including the Cherokee, initially sought to protect their territories by aligning with the British. Yet, post-war treaties ignored native sovereignty, and settlers expanded into their lands unchecked. The Treaty of Paris 1783, which ended the war, ceded vast native territories to the United States without consulting the tribes, signaling a new era of displacement and marginalization. Native Americans who fought in the conflict, on both British and American sides, often received little reward. Loyalist allies lost British protection after the war, while tribes that had sought accommodation with Americans were frequently pushed westward. These outcomes highlighted the stark contrast between revolutionary ideals of liberty and the realities of expansion and conquest. The revolution also altered trade and cultural relations. Tribes had previously engaged in commerce with European powers, trading furs, food, and other goods. Post-war, these trade networks shifted as Americans sought to assert economic and political control over Western territories. Native communities faced not only land loss, but also cultural disruption and pressure to assimilate. Visual depictions in a documentary could include maps showing territorial changes, illustrations of Iroquois and Cherokee leaders, reenactments of skirmishes, and archival images of treaties. Animated overlays can show the dramatic loss of native lands from 1775 to 1790. Emphasizing the human cost of independence for indigenous peoples. The story of Native Americans during the Revolution reminds viewers that the quest for liberty was not universal. While the United States fought for independence, Native nations often suffered displacement, broken promises, and marginalization. Their experiences highlight a critical, often overlooked dimension of the Revolution: that the expansion of freedom for some frequently meant dispossession for others. How does a revolution become official in the eyes of the world? Winning battles was only part of the struggle for American independence. Diplomacy proved equally vital in securing recognition, legitimacy, and the resources needed to sustain the new nation. From the earliest days, leaders understood that international alliances could determine the revolution's outcome. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay became central figures in this effort. Franklin's charm and intellect in Paris won the confidence of the French monarchy, leading to the Treaty of Alliance 1778. France provided money, troops, and a naval fleet, transforming the revolution from a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. French assistance was decisive, particularly in the southern campaigns and at Yorktown. Spain and the Netherlands also supported the American cause indirectly, engaging Britain in other theaters and diverting resources. Spanish Governor Bernardo de Galvez led campaigns along the Mississippi and Gulf Coast, capturing key forts and disrupting British supply lines, while the Dutch provided loans and commercial support. These international contributions underscored that the revolution had become a global struggle for influence and control. The formal end of the war came with the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Negotiated by Franklin, Adams, and Jay, the treaty recognized the United States as an independent nation, established generous territorial boundaries, from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, and secured fishing rights off Newfoundland. Britain also agreed to withdraw troops and recognize American sovereignty, providing the young nation with legitimacy on the world stage. Recognition had profound consequences. It allowed the United States to engage in trade, secure loans, and participate in diplomacy as a sovereign entity. International recognition also demonstrated that revolution, if well-led and strategically aligned, could successfully challenge a major empire. Diplomatic negotiations were not simple. American negotiators had to balance promises to allies, domestic expectations, and British demands. The resulting treaties reflected compromise, foresight, and a careful understanding of power dynamics. They established a foundation for the United States' future foreign policy, emphasizing negotiation, strategic alliances, and the protection of national interests. Visually, the documentary could depict maps showing territorial changes, sketches of negotiating teams, animated treaty text, and reenactments of diplomatic meetings. These elements make the abstract process of international recognition vivid and comprehensible for viewers. The revolution's diplomatic success illustrates that independence is not won solely on the battlefield. Political skill, international alliances, and negotiation were equally crucial, showing that the survival of a nation depends as much on diplomacy as on courage and combat. How does a revolutionary nation turn the chaos of independence into a functioning government? Victory in war gave the United States independence, but it also posed an immense challenge. Creating a government capable of uniting 13 diverse states, managing foreign relations, regulating commerce, and protecting the rights of citizens. The initial framework, the Articles of Confederation, proved insufficient. Congress could not levy taxes, regulate trade, or enforce laws, leaving the nation weak and vulnerable. The solution came in 1787 with the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Delegates, including George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton, debated fiercely. Key questions emerged. How much power should the federal government have? How should states be represented? How could liberty be protected while maintaining order? The resulting constitution created a federal system, balancing state and national authority. Power was divided among three branches: legislative, Congress representing both the people, House of Representatives, and the state's Senate making laws; executive, the president enforcing laws, managing foreign affairs, and commanding the military; judicial, courts including the Supreme Court, interpreting laws and protecting citizens' rights. Checks and balances ensured no branch could dominate, while the separation of powers prevented authoritarian rule. The Bill of Rights 1791 codified essential freedoms: speech, religion, assembly, and protection against governmental abuse, institutionalizing revolutionary ideals into law. Ratification was contested. Federalists argued that a strong central government was necessary for stability, while anti-federalists feared tyranny and demanded protections for individual liberties. Compromise led to the Bill of Rights and a new framework that balanced authority with freedom. The Constitution established not only governance structures, but also enduring principles: popular sovereignty, rule of law, and the idea that government derives legitimacy from the consent of the governed. It transformed revolutionary ideals into actionable, sustainable institutions. By 1791, the United States had completed a remarkable transformation. From rebellious colonies to a united, functioning republic with legal, political, and institutional frameworks designed to protect liberty, manage power, and adapt to the challenges of governance. The revolution had ended, but its legacy in law, government, and civic identity would continue to shape the nation forever. What does liberty truly mean, and how did the American Revolution redefine it? The Revolution was not simply a war against Britain, it was a radical experiment in self-determination. Colonists rejected hereditary authority and claimed that governments exist to serve the people. This redefinition of liberty emphasized rights, accountability, and participation, reshaping political philosophy worldwide. Yet, liberty was complex and contested. The ideals of freedom inspired new debates. Who should enjoy these rights? How could society balance individual freedoms with collective responsibility? The revolution planted the seeds for social, political, and legal reforms that would unfold over the next 2 centuries. The struggle for liberty also illuminated its limits. While white men gained political power, women, enslaved Africans, and Native Americans largely remained excluded. The revolution exposed a critical lesson. Freedom is not granted automatically. It requires vigilance, advocacy, and continuous effort. The American experiment shows that ideas can endure, even as societies evolve. Could the ideas born in 13 colonies truly change the world? The American Revolution became a model for oppressed and colonized peoples worldwide. Its declaration that governments derive power from the consent of the governed inspired revolutions across Europe, the Caribbean, and Latin America. France, in particular, experienced profound transformation, as revolutionary leaders adopted principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The French Revolution, 1789–1799, echoed both the rhetoric and the strategies of the American fight for independence. In Haiti, enslaved Africans were motivated by revolutionary ideals, leading to the Haitian Revolution, 1791–1804. Leaders like Toussaint Louverture applied the language of universal rights to their struggle, establishing the first Black Republic and showing that freedom could be claimed even under extreme oppression. Across Latin America, independence movements cited the American Revolution as proof that colonial rule could be challenged successfully. Figures such as Simón Bolívar and José de San Martin looked to the U.S. example when crafting constitutions, asserting sovereignty, and mobilizing citizens. Even European intellectuals debated the revolution's meaning. Some monarchs feared uprisings, while philosophers and reformers praised the American model as proof that republican ideals could succeed. The revolution demonstrated that principles, when combined with courage, organization, and strategy, could reshape nations. The American Revolution became a beacon of possibility, reshaping the political landscape far beyond its borders. How did the revolution change daily life, society, and the economy in the new United States? The war had disrupted traditional trade, production, and social hierarchies. Colonists who once relied on British imports were forced to adapt, fostering domestic industries, small-scale manufacturing, and local commerce. Artisans, farmers, and merchants became more self-reliant, while ports like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston expanded as hubs of domestic and international trade. Land ownership became central to social mobility. Policies like the Land Ordinance of 1785 and Northwest Ordinance of 1787 allowed settlers to purchase and cultivate Western territories, creating opportunities for wealth and influence, while also displacing native populations. These measures shaped the social structure of the early republic, linking property, citizenship, and political participation. New social norms emerged as well. While hierarchies persisted, the revolution had disrupted rigid class structures in many regions. Ordinary citizens now had a voice in local politics, militias, and town meetings, fostering a culture of civic responsibility. Education expanded, particularly in northern states, as leaders recognized that informed citizens were essential to sustaining democracy. Economic transformation also had challenges. Inflation, debt, and uneven access to resources created hardships, especially for small farmers and rural communities. Yet the young nation's entrepreneurial spirit persisted, laying the foundation for early American industry, trade networks, and financial systems under Alexander Hamilton's policies. Culturally, the revolution fostered national identity. Symbols such as the flag, commemorative events, and shared stories of heroism helped unify citizens across geography and class. Public memory, shaped through literature, newspapers, and education, reinforced a sense of belonging to a new, independent nation. The revolution did more than win independence. It reshaped how Americans lived, worked, and related to each other. From economic innovation to social mobility, the early republic began a journey that would continue to define the United States for centuries. Winning independence was only the beginning. How did the United States survive its first years under the weight of debt, unrest, and political uncertainty? The Revolutionary War left the nation deeply in debt. Both the federal government and individual states had borrowed heavily to fund military campaigns. Inflation, unpaid soldiers, and unsettled debts threatened economic stability. Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, introduced bold financial policies, assuming state debts, creating a national bank, and establishing a system of taxation. These measures stabilized the economy but sparked fierce political debate. Domestic unrest also challenged the new republic. Shays' Rebellion 1786-1787, led by Massachusetts farmers protesting debt and foreclosures, exposed weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. The rebellion underscored the need for a stronger federal government capable of maintaining order, ultimately influencing the drafting of the Constitution. Political divisions emerged early. Federalists advocating for a strong central government clashed with anti-federalists, who feared concentration of power and sought protections for individual rights. These debates shaped the nation's first political parties and set the tone for future disagreements over governance, federal authority, and citizen participation. Foreign challenges also tested the young nation. Britain maintained posts in the Great Lakes region, Spain restricted access to the Mississippi River, and France sought repayment for wartime loans. Diplomacy was essential to safeguard independence and secure economic stability, demonstrating that the revolution's success required ongoing vigilance. Visually, this segment can include reenactments of Shays' Rebellion, animated charts of national debt, sketches of Federalist and Anti-Federalist debates, and maps showing contested territories. Highlighting both domestic turmoil and international pressures emphasizes the fragility and resilience of the early United States. The early years of the Republic proved that independence was only the first step. Economic stability, political cohesion, and national security required careful planning, negotiation, and compromise. The challenges faced by the new nation demonstrated that freedom demanded not only courage, but also wisdom, foresight, and adaptability. Why does the American Revolution still matter more than 2 centuries later? The Revolution created a nation, but it also created an idea that ordinary people can claim their rights, challenge oppression, and shape the future. Its legacy is not only political, it is social, cultural, and moral. The principles of liberty, equality, and self-governance continue to inspire debates about freedom, justice, and citizenship around the world. The revolution also teaches a lesson about complexity. Freedom was won for some, while denied to others, slaves, women, and Native Americans. These contradictions remind us that revolutions are rarely perfect and that the struggle for equality is ongoing. Modern movements for civil rights, gender equality, and indigenous sovereignty can trace part of their philosophical lineage to the ideals and unfinished work of 1776. Economically, the revolution set a precedent for innovation, entrepreneurship, and adaptation. Americans learned to navigate uncertainty, build institutions, and manage trade and finance independently. Socially, it encouraged civic engagement, education, and the cultivation of national identity, demonstrating that independence requires active participation from citizens, not just a declaration of sovereignty. Globally, the revolution remains a model for challenging entrenched power structures. From Europe to Latin America to the Caribbean, movements for independence, democracy, and human rights have drawn inspiration from the American example. Its story proves that ideas backed by action can cross borders, reshape societies, and endure through generations. For modern audiences, the revolution is more than history, it is a mirror. It asks, how do we defend liberty? How do we reconcile ideals with reality? How do we ensure that freedom is extended to all, not just a select few? These questions remain relevant today, demonstrating that the revolution is both a historical event and a living guide for civic life. The American Revolution, therefore, is not confined to 1776-1783. It is an ongoing story of human aspiration, courage, and perseverance. It reminds us that liberty is a work in progress, requiring dedication, vigilance, and participation. Its lessons resonate globally, affirming that the fight for freedom is both universal and timeless.